welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us. We always find a nice intro question to ask is sort of your sort of academic journey. Like, how did you sort of get interested into the things you do now, and sort of like how did you sort of change as you got at the more and more advanced levels? So, was your entry onto this sort of career path and these research interests one of sort of progressive changes, or were there specific moments that pulled you towards writers like Marx or in issues of indigenous environmental justice?
Right. These are defining two different time periods in my life. Marx was early on, right from childhood, because my mother was interested in student politics and she had read a lot of Marx and she introduced me. So I was fascinated with Marx as a babe, but not really in academic sense, because I grew up in India and there was a lot of other entry points to socialism, socialist thought, and kind of engagement with national liberation, revolutionary questions, mostly with those who wrote in native languages. So there was Marx as an aspirational figure, and then there was several other entry points. And then once I ventured into academia, Marx became kind of textbook, because you surround yourself with fellow Marxists, and it's kind of rigorous study. You do it as a text, not merely as an aspiration or someone who's fascinated with it. You can continue to be fascinated with him, but you still need to do kind of doctrinal, robust study and engage in a dialogue and conversations. That was different. But my PhD work was absolutely different, because I was interested in environment conservation and indigenous movements, but I never thought I would do a PhD on it, because my specialization was criminal law. So I wanted to do criminology, but ended up having a break. So I went back to India and worked for 2 years in a policy think tank, which I deeply regretted, and then rushed back to academia to do my MPhil in environmental policy in Cambridge. And at that point, I was thinking of a longer question that would also be meaningful and chime with my research interests and also contribute differently, because I'm always thinking about how academia can collaborate with communities and people's movements. So not really exist in the abstract. Theory cannot be detached from lived experiences and lived reality. So I was thinking of what's the closest that can come to this. And I thought of indigenous movements. And because I'm trained as a lawyer, what do courts do in these contexts, and how do they contribute to environmental movements, and how do they receive inputs from environmental movements, was intriguing. So I thought that had a lot of questions to be explored, and that's how I started my PhD.
Oh, he's on the phone. Okay. I thought he was going to say something.
No, sorry. I'm just checking the levels, because last time there was a problem with my mic where I couldn't be heard on the stream. So this time around, I'm trying to be a little bit more careful. But yeah, thank you so much for that origin story. Sakshi is fantastic. One of the questions that I really want to ask you, because this is kind of how I found you on Twitter. As terrible of a place as Twitter is, sometimes it can also be a wonderful place. I mean, that's how we find most of our guests these days. Before that, I think I used to go on like specific university websites and NGO websites and just email people, in the lists of like environmental scientists and social scientists and such. But Twitter, even though it makes me angry as hell sometimes, it's also a fantastic place to be able to see like-minded people and also just view like fantastic research that's being published and all of that. And it is indeed the place where I saw one of your posts, which I have to say, so this was a review of a book which you seem to not have been so happy about, or it seems to have, let you down, so at least a little bit. I'm talking, of course, about Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline.
Yep.
So I wanted to maybe start with that, because that's personally how I found you online, was this review of this book. What did Malm get so wrong in his sort of manifesto, in your opinion? Because Malm, for people listening who don't know him, is an academic, I think he calls himself a Marxist, I think, right?
Yeah, he uses a lot of Marx, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Marxist academic, Swedish, who has become quite a strong voice in terms of the leftist environmentalist spheres. But as Sakshi wrote, there's still a lot to say. It's not perfect, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So what would you say about his book?
My introduction to Malm, sorry, I cut you off, but my introduction
okay.
to Malm was a couple of years ago. Maybe I was 25, 26 when I first read Fossil Capital. And that was based out of his PhD thesis, which is absolutely good work and fascinating. And he did engage with kind of fossil infrastructure, its genesis and the historic origins of why capital requires this kind of infrastructure to perpetuate, which is great. I mean, you cannot go mess up with your PhD thesis. That's a solid 3 or 4 years of work gone into that book. And I expected something that depth when I read How to Blow Up a Pipeline, because I had already started, this is forward by 4 years or something. When I read How to Blow Up a Pipeline, I had started work, and I had questioned my own approach, academic approach to Indigenous questions, because once I started working and once I started interacting with Indigenous scholars and Indigenous communities, the people I'm supposed to be working with, it was shocking how little we knew and how impervious we were to our own privileges and knowledge systems and epistemologies that are so grounded in, say, the Western framework. So the coloniality of our own approaches, questions never really strike us until someone else points that out. So when I went out for my field work in Canberra in 2019, 2020, and the kind of questions and grilling that communities did, because we were coming from Oxford and Cambridge and asking these stupid questions about why is it so, and the ground realities of movements are so different, how they engage with the state, how they engage with surveillance, penal systems, how they engage with the extractive industries themselves. So for us, it's nice enough to see this is a pitched battle between two sides, but for them, it's so much more layered and so much more included in how economies and social fabric is built around this extractivism. So the kind of interrogation is not that of hostility, but strategy and caution as well. So there was a lot of publicity around How to Blow Up Pipeline, because I thought, obviously pipelines, where do pipelines lay? It's on Indigenous territories. And I was like, okay, he's got to start with this kind of regenerated anger directing towards extractivism and engaging with existing social movements of, because we don't know anything about pipeline. If you live in the UK or in the Sweden and Germany, you can think of certain degrees of resistance to fossil infrastructure, but there is a limit to how much you can oppose them, because all of them are in Indigenous land or people of color or Black people engaging with these fossil infrastructure foregrounds what we can do. But the book had none of it. And I was like, that's very strange. Something is very, very wrong with this kind of approach, which really, really doesn't think there's already a movement that precedes what your approach is. So what is your anger against fossil infrastructure should emerge from who's being eliminated, whose land has been dispossessed, and who's been erased in this conversation. I mean, averting this planetary crisis is important for all of us. We are worried for the future. We are worried for the planet, of course, but this is not new. And this has been ongoing since the beginning of colonialism. So the land has been dispossessed, not because there's a coal mine, but there are other infrastructures. The dispossession can happen even with green infrastructures. It can happen with geoengineering. It can happen with your exact solution to colonialism. So unless your anger against pipelines starts with your anger against colonialism and extractive capitalism. It's very incomplete. It's this deliberate ignorance of the book that made me angry, which led to writing 2 different reviews.
Oh yeah, 2.
Very,
I think
very,
I only
very
saw one.
The first review was promised into praise, and it was going to be delayed, and I was extremely angry in January, so I decided to write the one in Progress in Political Economy. So there are 2 different things.
Okay, yeah, I mean, anger can be a wonderful fuel sometimes.
Yes.
So would you say, though, that Malm still in some ways does succeed where a lot of others have failed in seeing the central thesis of his book as being that of resistance? And correct me if I'm wrong, I personally have only read a very small part of the book. I only found out about the book a couple months ago. But he does kind of he does push for a little bit of the dismissal of nonviolent intervention, right? Would you say that, like, there is still things to be learned from that book, or is it something that, because it's missing that crucial element, it offers maybe more not whole knowledge that then would not be of as much of use as other books that we should read?
I mean, I don't think there's any book which is well-meaning that needs to be dismissed. You don't have to entirely dismiss Malm's contribution as well, because, well, yes, there's some kind of anger that is required to how you want to respond now. I mean, if you look at the unbridled expansion of fossil infrastructure, despite what we are facing and despite the scientific evidence, all of us are going to be angry, and you want to do something immediately. So slashing a tire of the SUV might find yourself satisfactory, but what does that achieve? So that's a question. I mean, Indigenous people haven't been non-violent, but they've been claiming and defending their land. So that just brings on so much violence merely because they are there at the front line, fighting a battle that is essential for the integrity of their land, environment, cultural relationships. So there's this different framing required for what is violence and what is non-violence. So Malm's contestation might be with Extinction Rebellion and their claims for what is a non-violent practice. We just sit around, do yoga on Oxford seat, and that's going to attract attention from the establishment. That's not going to work. And Malm's critique of Extinction Rebellion is very just in that sense. But also, I mean, then you're talking about a distinction between violence and non-violence in a very privileged sense, which is mostly palpable to white Western nations. Elsewhere, the dynamics change. So there's usefulness of the book. But if you want to really start with how do you want to engage with social movement, then might as well start reading Indigenous scholars, because Nick is, and he's talking about Dakota and
Your history is our future.
And the subsequent scholarship around Red Nation and the Red Deal. These are important contribution to how Indigenous movements are being carried out. And if you want to have a look at very recent book by John Barker, The Red Scare, it interrogates how settler nations have been making terrorists out of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous movements, because that's necessary. Either they're there as a passive subjects, or they are someone to be quelled as resisting voices. So I think our starting point should be from Indigenous voices, the Black Indigenous people of color who have actually had to face the state violent machinery and apparatus and to resist it.
Yeah, and one such situation that I wonder if you've been following or keeping an eye on is that of the Wet'suwet'en in British Columbia, because I know you've done some work in Canada, possibly. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
And yeah, it's it's a topic that I'm hoping to do my master's thesis on, the insurgency and counterinsurgency tactics between the two. I was just wondering what your analysis of the situation there in British Columbia is, if you if you've been keeping up with the events and what you think about it. Also, I'm very curious about your perspective in terms of you being a law specialist, like what you think in terms of the law that's being followed or breached from the parties there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I had to look at some of their cases for my thesis. I've looked at Australia, Brazil, and Canada entirely from the perspective of what courts do. And Canada is an interesting example, because you expect Brazil to do terribly because of their political conditions, and this Bolsonaro, you expect them to do horribly. But when political conditions are really falling apart, then surprisingly, you find courts stepping in to do better things than what politics and the democratic apparatus can offer. So Brazil does better than Canada, and Canada is doing poorly because they have had treaties, which gives certain degree of complacency in how you think, okay, we have agreed to this standard form of contract, which is anyway founded on very imbalanced power structures. I mean, when did First Nations have equal power with the settler state to negotiate equal terms? So you are holding on to that land or on certain contractual basis, but the state can take it away at any point. It can open more oil and tar sands industries. It can always bring forth more coal industries on indigenous land, all because you have treaty rights which can be taken away at the whim of someone. So this existence of treaties and some form of Section 35 constitutional recognition makes this conversation very skewed. So because there's already a token liberal recognition, I think I'd really pitch in Glenn Coulthard's work. He looks at how liberal state grants right in order to take them away and suppress any more conversation about how to foreground indigenous sovereignty and self-determination in a true sense. So we're never having this question of sovereignty because you have had some contractual understanding through limited treaty rights. So
they sort of assimilate the conflict, don't they?
Yes, exactly that. And worst is, it's not a treaty right, is not a given right. Every time you want to claim a right, then you have to go to court. That just prolongs a lengthy litigation that comes at a cost. I mean, First Nations have limited resources which they need for health and welfare and education to keep up their land, maintain their communities. The state isn't going to grant any of it, and at least not without looking down on them for grabbing welfare. These resources cannot be wasted in prolonged litigation. That's a problem. But every time they want to claim a right over their land, they have to prove it is their land. They have to prove they belong to this community. They have to prove through colonization they have maintained this continuity or exact set of rights. Every time they have to be proved before courts. Their land has to be proved before courts. So all of the cosmologies and ontologies of their other relationship with land and environment gets disturbed and torn apart every time they go and talk in this liberal settler language of belonging, possession, and property rights. So, and that's a problem with Wet'suwet'en First Nations. There's never been a treaty. So now they cannot have one because, well, it's profitable land and any industry can establish themselves over there. It's in the interest of Canadian government not to have a treaty. But they have been sovereign people of that land for time immemorial, and obviously there will be resistance. And every time they put a flag there and establish blockades and stop the Canadian government or extractive industries from moving further, it's a small victory for the entire notion of indigenous sovereignties, because they're trying to establish something for the first time beyond those treaties. And I think it has to be respected. It has to be supported in every instance possible. That's a long answer for your question.
No. It's exactly what we want as well. We like the depth. We we try with the podcast to go depth and accessibility. We try to mix the two. One of the things that really astounded me about the case, and this is kind of why I decided to choose specifically for my thesis, was the way in which I think that there's that glass shattering moment a little bit for a lot of people when they realized that the state, or even this kind of like created narrative about, for example, Canada being like a very good, nice place that takes in a lot of refugees and blah blah blah, all that stuff. When that like image is shattered, I think it causes a lot of like what's the word, dissonance, like cognitive dissonance almost, for people. Like, what, that can't be right. Canada fucking people up with for extractive industries? No way. But one of the really interesting things I thought was that there are even legal cases that have been won that still don't seem to truly change things. Like I'm gonna absolutely butcher the name because I unfortunately haven't been able to find a voice version of this, but the Delmaguk, I think it's Delmaguk versus
the climate litigation, I think
it was 1994. Delmaguk versus the state of British Columbia, which was a case where the Wet'suwet'en sued the state and managed to basically establish their area.
Delgamuk.
Delgamuk. Oh my god. Yeah. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm terrible with names. Yes, they managed to win the case and actually establish an area, quite like big area of British Columbia, which was a fantastic victory. But even that doesn't seem to really affect the like very real outcome that today the state can just send in plane loads of militarized police and of the CIRG, the really shady community industry response group, to basically come in and chainsaw doors down and point rifles in and arrest journalists. Like, I don't know, I guess a lot of people looking at this case will probably be wondering, how can the law protect us if even those victories, like the case we mentioned before, can't help us still?
I mean, Canada has had long history with RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and it's always been just violent history. And the jurisprudence is interesting because Delgamuk was 1997, and it didn't do much in terms of concrete solutions, because that was the first time the court accepted that indigenous evidence can be accepted merely as an evidence and does not require validation by expert evidence. And then native title, there was always a question of Aboriginal title, and because it was not an issue in contest, the main issue that was contested, it was only an obiter, which means an observation by the court that native title existed pre-colonization and it shouldn't have to be proved, and it sent back the case to trial court. So they had to wait for another 7 years until 2014, where Chilkat Nations established that Aboriginal title exists and it does not require excessive proof, and the mere sovereignty does not eliminate the fact that Aboriginal title pre-exists colonization. And these are very incremental changes that comes through courts, and it's difficult for a settler court to put colonization on trial. So that's the entire core of my thesis. What can they do, in fact? So there's always going to be this minor moments when they can sneak in this challenge to colonization or have a self-reflective juridical space that challenges settler states, because they can never contest state sovereignty. That is not allowed in the courts because there's separation of powers and the court can only go so much. But there are smaller things that judges have been managing to do, especially if you have noticed the last week, there's a new case, Thomas Sykes versus British Columbia, where the British Columbian Supreme Court had this very self-reflective moment when they realized that all the laws and the Aboriginal title they have been enforcing has its roots in colonization. So what do we do? So there's tiny moments of these observations which can build up to a greater outcome later. Maybe in another 5 years' time, we can have a better equipped court to deal with this question of how do you recognize plural sovereignties and indigenous sovereignties without challenging state sovereignty. So while courts make this huge contribution, it needs allies in social and economic spaces as well. So the movements contribute to how courts engage with these issues, because judges look at the world, no matter how neutral they want to be, they are always conscious about what's going on. So the Canadian Supreme Court in 1990s were far less progressive than what it is today. And we have had this incremental moments. Less so in Canada, but in Australia, we find a lot more hopefulness, because they don't even have a proper constitution which can give you rights. So there's no question of human rights even. So when there is nothing, courts are forced to be innovative. So courts can do very little. And the kind of laws that can be enforced is primarily from the state. What can be enforced is kind of degree of hopefulness from courts. I think in that sense, courts have been doing a little more than before.
Yeah, and in terms of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, do you see that as having had a, like not just being a, a text, like a piece of paper, or has it been a little bit of a letdown? Because I know that British Columbia and Canada in general has only very recently accepted. I think they were part of the 3 or 4 nations, something like that, or like a handful of nations.
They were Australia, New Zealand, Canada. They didn't want to sign the United Nations Declaration. But well, I mean, you don't even want to hide that you're nasty.
It's like everyone's like, yes, we respect Indigenous people. Canada.
And Canada is like, no, maybe not.
We don't need to prove it. We're nice.
I mean, British Columbia, for instance, has enacted that UNDRIP into an act. So it's technically an act which can be enforced in British Columbian province, but really it's one of the provinces that's really doing badly in terms of Indigenous rights as well. So what do you do with these conventions, instruments, and laws? It's always a huge question.
So it seems like a really important factor for movements such involving rural workers or Indigenous peoples who are having their land repossessed by states or corporate bodies. A really important factor seems to be how well organized, how politically active, and how much the group in question associates with one another, and how actually well organized they are as a political unit to resist these external pressures. And in some instances that single factor seems to be so important, it can lead to a movement success, like with the landless workers movement. So I'm really curious to know how this factor of sort of group organization or group sort of political activeness interacts with the factors that you're engaging with, such as sort of representation in court, or more interestingly, sort of, I don't know how to put it, foreign influential figures speaking on their behalf. I wonder how these sort of factors interact and sort of perhaps augment one another.
Yeah, I mean, with the people I see, nobody is speaking on their behalf, thankfully, so there's less of contradiction. But I see where this discourse comes from, because pastoralists, farmers, anyone who has anything to do with land always has this conflicting interest, especially if I think of Australia, which is closer to heart. There's always the existence, an equivalent of Delgamuk was the 1992 judgment of Mabo. So it recognized native title of Indigenous people. And obviously the question comes with, they have to go to the court every time and prove it. But the first time 1992 decision came out, there was certain whipping up of anguish and anxiety around Indigenous lands being recognized, because that essentially, I mean, it helps the political discourse to whip up that kind of frenzy around Indigenous title. That simply means your lands are going to be taken away and given to Indigenous people. That's not going to happen, because even through the aboriginal title, the lands are not secure, and they still have to go to courts and prove themselves. And that kind of conflict between whoever has interest in the land especially pastoralists and farmers and indigenous communities have been conflicting because the state has created these regimes of rights and interests over land, which ensures they can never be allies, although it is in their best interest to be allies because they are fighting the same cause, the kind of capitalistic legal structure that enables divisions and dissenting voices. It's not in their interest to break up all this, and these interests aren't really hostile to each other, right? Indigenous sovereignty means you use those land on their terms and not on the terms of settler state. It doesn't mean they have an exclusive possession and they're going to exclude you for lifetime. And the need to build allies have been, it's felt in pockets. If you look at Wave Hill walk-off in Australia in 1970s, 1980s, which defined kind of social movement and social fabric, that's the labor unions and indigenous communities and land councils and farmers, they came together to resist oppressive industrial conditions and claim equal wages and fair conditions. So smaller examples, which we must make big paradigms out of these smaller instances, because it's vital, especially in environmental movements, where these interests must align together. They have to come together. Now to maintain that farming communities, pastoralists and indigenous peoples are opposing, it's kind of false equivalence as well, because the largest landholders in places like Australia are the extractive industries themselves. So Gina Reinhardt, she holds the biggest pack of land and she's a multi-billionaire, and she's been running cattle stations and mines and uranium mines, whatever their interests are. It's tangled. There's a very small community of people who are actually holding small lands, and I mean, none of these come in conflict with indigenous people at all. So the social movement and the question of solidarity is now ever more important than was before, because whatever we have in terms of precedents, we have enjoyed these kind of successes, as in Wave Hill or the other instances. Labor unions coming together to march for indigenous native title in certain pockets, something like Queensland and South Australia. These are important. Both groups have looked at each other, looked out for each other. And I think we need to forge our future movements in these lines, align those interests. And none of them are necessarily conflicting, and there are easy ways of getting out of it, unless you're conflicting with the big mining interest and landholding interests.
I think we've kind of gone around it a little bit, but we haven't addressed it specifically. Your thesis.
Yes.
Could we maybe like talk about it just in a little bit more detail? I don't know if you have like I guess since you're submitting it soon, you probably have a a proper title and everything. Could you tell us a little bit about your thesis and kind of the angle that you're going for?
Yeah. So I've called it very fancily Sacred Justices Looking for Indigenous Environment Justice in Courts. So very self-explanatory.
Yeah, no, it's nice. It's a nice title.
So yeah, it's a comparative study of Indigenous environmental litigation in Australia, Brazil, and Canada. So I was trying to pick out settler colonial nations and a hybrid colonial nation, which is Brazil, plagued by internal colonization, and Australia and New Zealand were done to death, and that was my MPhil thesis. So I want to do something bigger, and three countries try to look at their differing constitutional positions, differing social conditions, but similar legal and political histories, trying to explore what do courts do and how do courts engage with the question of Indigenous environmental justice. So we know environmental justice, there's plenty of literature now which had bided its time, and its question of how environmental harms disproportionately affect races and ethnic communities, whether it's a deliberate choice or not. Indigenous environmental justice is a question of land and indigenous sovereignty. So it's not a mere question of whether environmental harms are disproportionately affecting them. If they are, then that's a direct causal effect of settler colonialism. So the question of environmental harm, environmental injustice begins at the point of dispossession. Will any of this make to courts? And there's mixed results coming out of it, because Australia's had very recent history in recognizing Indigenous rights, and they still don't constitutionally recognize Indigenous voice. So what do courts do under these circumstances when courts have to foreground Indigenous voices? Because these are all settler institutions, there's a contradiction of how do you challenge settler framework while using the same apparatus that allows these people to come before courts. Australia is doing all right. Brazil is surprisingly doing well because they have a strong constitution, but also a very poor political community, which is torn apart by Bolsonaro, and there's increasing challenges because they can see Amazon being destroyed, and the only guardians that are there are Amazonian communities themselves. And when they are the voice of climate movements, they are going to be more proactive. And Canada, we just discussed mixed complacency and some kind of promise, because increasing police violence against communities are getting on the nerves of judges as well. So it's a kind of mixed bag. I'm aiming for a very hopeful message of trying to use juridical spaces more, because the only incremental changes we can get is from a well-dated authoritative space like courts. So a good radical jurisprudence is going to push social movements in certain directions and for the best, and also try to demonstrate that judges have been listening to people's voices and people's movement, and that explains a lot of hopefulness that we find in these judgments, especially judgments related to climate change. So I'm looking at this new jurisprudence, especially in the last 15 years or so, and what we can learn for the immediate future. And that's my thesis.
Sounds
Thank you.
sounds amazing. Do you know when? Because I'm 110% sure that I'll want to read it and potentially quote some of it for my own, or at least to like learn from it. Do you know when? I mean, if it will be available for people to read, and if so, when?
Yeah, I mean, I should be able to make it public in some form by end of January, but hopefully
Cool.
get a book sometime later.
Awesome. That sounds really good. And yeah, the title sounds fantastic. It's one of the very few victories I think we can have in academia, is to choose our own titles and to make them as nice as we want. I've seen some absolute bangers over the years. I mean, I don't know, especially in the physical sciences, I have seen some really ridiculously funny ones. I know one of our friends, Pablo, friend of the show, Pablo Bilbao, just published his first paper ever, I think, on lasers. Some really advanced physics stuff that I can't understand. I think the title of it was like, what do you call it? It was a set of letters that basically makes up the word crêpe, you know, like pancake. And so his first paper is just called pancake, basically. It's like, we could never do that in social science. I saw kind of a little bit linked to this legal stuff. You wrote a really what I found to be a fascinating article about a really niche topic as well, I think. I mean, niche in my own lived experience. I think it was last year or the year before, that was titled Marxist Legal Theory and Indigeneity. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I understood most of it, but you know, for those of us, not me, who are not law experts, could you tell us a little bit about what a Marxist analysis of law is, and how does this concept of indigeneity really and settler colonialism influence fit into that?
Yeah, Okay, yes. I mean, there's some things you don't read after you've written, and I haven't read it since 2020.
we can skip. You can press the skip. We should have actually a button that says skip the question.
Pass. No, I mean, that was intriguing. For me, it was very intriguing question because that was the kind of response to John Bellamy Foster's article on Marx has dealt with the indigenous question very satisfactorily. And I was like, no, because if you look at law, then there's different kind of engagement that Marx, there's nothing Marx hasn't touched on. And he's a fascinating man who's extensively done his homework and his insights into how society works, how economic organization organizes themselves. That's fascinating. And then his conception of law is very, very helpful in how the power networks within law and outside of law responds. I think it's a better job than what most jurists have accomplished. Maybe except Julius Stone, he's really good. You should look him up. He's an Australian jurist. But well, the Marxist legal theory is Marx primarily looks at law has been put in place for the smooth functioning of the capitalist foundations of the economic transactions and not necessarily to empower anyone. And he's not very optimistic of the multiple roles that law can embody. And he sees that as an extension of an oppressive apparatus. And the kind of law he was exposed to and the kind of the legal system he looked into, and is very accurate in that analysis. But people have been thinking about law since whenever we had this system of organization, governance, and regulation, right? So what does law mean to us now? We need to have an improved understanding of what law can do. And Marxist theory holds true for lot of things even now, because the kind of extractive capitalism, colonialism, the kind of financial transactions, and the entire existing capitalist economy operates on in the same framework. But at the same time, we've been using law to empower human rights, gender equality, equality between sexes, indigenous rights, because that was closer to heart. Marx also looked at indigenous peoples and their exploitation. So he had this tiny bit in chapter 24 and 25 in The Capital, where he talks about establishing colonies to facilitate your market and expropriation. The question of expropriation accumulation is true even now, but indigenous people are engaging with the same state against whom they are establishing their sovereignty. Indigenous people are fighting the same extractive industries in court, despite the fact they know that neither the state nor the court is an ally. And why is that, was my question. And the kind of engagement that we see from courts, which are allegedly this very integral part of the law, the same oppressive apparatus, and they are responding to people in different ways. So what happens to this question of expropriation and accumulation? We need to have a broader approach to how we understand law now and how we understand what law is capable of, or who holds the reins and who controls it. They're not necessarily one force that is controlling. You may tighten up your strings, you may have more laws that facilitate accumulation, and yet there are avenues and interstices which can break down the exact system, and that's what we are seeing. So a new approach to Marxist legal theory must understand this multiple other spaces of resistance and multiple other interpretations and interlocutors, and that can come from the Black indigenous people of scholarship who've had different experiences of law and legal apparatus and the exact extractive capitalism, because once your experiences are filtered through these spaces, then you're going to have a different approach. So we just can't no longer stick to what Marx said. I mean, we have an obligation to do our homework, because the old man 150 years ago did an excellent job of doing research. So what do we do now? We can't just hold on to him. We need to build on him. And that's not a new thought, really. Samir Amin has always pitched for it. And he has said our responsibility is to carry from where Marx started and not just end it there. So there we are.
Yeah, that's true. I feel like that's definitely not said enough as well. I mean, I have to say a lot of even just academics, but also just Marxist voices, let's call them, do, like you say, end on Marx. I I was wondering in terms of this Marxist analysis of law. You talked about the. Sorry, let me just get the article up because I don't want to mess up the. No, I think I lost it. Damn it! I had it in my tabs, but I don't have it anymore. Okay. Anyways, I was just gonna say how you see the concept of this Marxist law and indigeneity fit into the concept of I don't know if you've heard of ZADs, like zone à défendre. I don't know. I've
Yeah,
never
yeah,
heard people
yeah.
say the term, so I don't know
Zed.
how people say it. ZAD. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
ZAD. Yeah. Because they seem to. There seems to be a lot of like these sort of alternative spaces and oh yeah, thank you for that. A lot of alternative spaces and such that kind of go against the current system, at least from people like us who aren't scholars of law. That's like in the best way that I can put it is just that these spaces seem to really run counter to the current institutions that we have. And the ZADs, for example, in France, though they're not indigenous spaces, there are local spaces. They're usually farmer led or farmer kind of populated, and they faced a lot of legal troubles in the current like climate and in the recent years. Do you think that there are ways to influence the law to make these sort of things possible, or do you see things like ZADs, these kind of more creative alternatives? Do you think they will always kind of run counter to this system that we're in? Like, is there actually a way to make these kind of creative, destructive spaces legal and without issue?
Yeah, I mean, it should be, right? These destructive places should be mainstream and it shouldn't be really necessarily seen as destructive because organizing community and multiple ways of living and living well, which is why indigenous philosophies have always been saying there's alternate ways of world making and earth making, kind of relationship we have with our community, social structures, economic structures can be entirely different and perfectly productive and constructive. So I mean, indigenous people aren't everywhere, but where they aren't, there are other communities which are at the receiving end of their oppressive structures. So, see, UK has the history of labor movements and coal mining communities which held their ground, organized their communities in a way that at least makes life marginally better for themselves. So establishing cooperative and thinking of how we can challenge existing systems without destroying the fabric of life. I mean, what we need is creative existence. And if you appreciate this planet, if you appreciate life, which is the best thing we have ever had, then we also have to think different ways of organizing ourselves. And that won't be too counterintuitive. I mean, look at the kind of I mean, UK is being terrible in terms of courts. I don't know where to think of an example from West, but if you look at, say, Peru or Mexico, anywhere, the Latin American nations where there are multiple forms of ethnic communities, and this small kind of resistance always going on. People have lived, Middle East, the Libyan, the Yemenis and Syrians, and the kind of where they're constantly facing challenges. They manage to survive only because they always find these interstices or find organizing life differently. I mean, you just have to think and you just have to believe there's different way of world making practices that is possible. So I always fall back on indigenous thought because they've always set as an example, and it is possible to live with the land and resources in ways which is not non-extractive but constructive, and this degree of codependency and not just giving and taking. So these are values. If you want to think of an alternative way of living, even if you're not on indigenous land, then there are terms and frameworks that from indigenous thought, we can use that. And yes, I mean, if you this all in knowing and information and epistemologies, courts aren't going to be too distant. If judges trained in different ways, which is one of my pitch in my thesis, because some judges are doing it because they can, and they have learned and read and thought differently. So all of us, if we can read and think and know there are multiple ways of living, and not to be surprised or shocked by creative challenges to what we think is mainstream or conventional, then alternate world is possible.
One of the things that I know, I feel bad even asking it, because I know that focusing on individual actions sometimes can be a huge detriment to the systemic changes. But something that Jamie and I often ask our guests is, what if anything, what can the common person do? You know, people watching this or listening to this, what would you say that they can do to, I guess, in this case, maybe influence not the courts themselves, but influence the way in which courts will engage with climate and environment and indigenous issues and land rights? Are there concrete steps that individuals can take, or do you see this as more just of a, like, really just a systemic challenge?
It is both. I mean, none of that is purely structural. None of this is purely individual. I mean, there can't be a concrete example that I can think of, but I think every now and then all our privileges get to be challenged, and at some point you should stop being defensive about it, because if there's a racial privilege, there's a class privilege, and that's going to be challenged in this alternative world making practices. And as long as you're trying to protect it, nothing changes. Even if you're doing very personal changes towards climate, you're altering your ways of consumption, but you're still very much a part of certain social classes. And if you're keeping the racial privilege intact, I mean, if there's question of everyday racism, are you going to do something at that in a personal level, or you're going to be blind to it because it never really affects you? None of the environmental, climate, social, political questions are detached from race, the question of the race at all. So none of these questions are different. So it's a question of, where do you want to make a change? Do you want to make a change everywhere? Do you want to make a change in how you understand? Do you want to make a change in how your families are organized? Do you want to make a change to educate people around you? Do you want to challenge their presumptions? Do you want to challenge existing power inequalities where you can see it? I mean, you can see that in your everyday lives. You can see that within universities. Before we venture into even common people, we academics, we are behind desks all the time. So you have the privilege of voice. What do you want to use it for? Do you want to raise your voice and raise your concerns? You do want to write about it, even if you can't do anything. You can't be an armchair critic or armchair activist for long. Just speak up, show yourself in activism and movement, and where you can make it. There's plenty of places. You just have to keep looking. That's it. I mean, I'm not in a position to preach at all, because I keep wondering, what am I doing after this thesis? Is it just a matter of writing 80,000 words? So have I done something concrete in these time gone by? Because that's important. Even if the thesis is substantial, I want it to be making a difference somewhere to the communities.
Yeah, I think you're not alone in that sentiment. I think you're not the first, and you won't be the last, because I think academics everywhere feel that like want to make a difference. But like you said, armchair activism, you mentioned it's such a difficult problem to get around, I think, in today's society, with, I don't know, especially the proliferation of social media and how easy it has been made, not become, but has been made easy to really, like, designed to be easy to resist anything by just clicks of buttons. And I mean, then, you know, in a way, like Jamie and I doing this this show even is in a way, I think, also armchair activism for sure. I mean, I'm sitting on my couch literally because I don't have an office, but I would be sitting in a chair with arms on the chair if I could, if I owned one.
The drink if you could as well.
Yeah. But you know, I think there are different levels, and though awareness is always a little bit overdone maybe in some aspects, I think that's just important, to just pair things up, like to go at it. It's to go at it from a multitude of different like angles and points, and to not just tweet and talk on shows, but also to protest and to take part in actions and ask the communities what they want and need, and these sort of things. That's at least how I've seen it in the recent past. I think we're maybe going to start closing up slowly, but I don't know if well, Jamie, can I or do you want to ask about the Rio Tinto, or should I?
No, go ahead. I know you want to.
Okay. I always out talk him though. I don't know. I'm the more talkative. You know what? I will live it. It's okay. I accept it. But yeah, one of the cases that you've written about is that of the company Rio Tinto, and it seems to be of particular importance these days. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about your work around Rio Tinto and their behavior in recent years, and maybe kind of like contextualizing it in the more general sphere of extractivism and green criminology, kind of that you've had experience in, if that kind of behavior fits the general trends also? That's why I'm wondering.
I mean, yes, I mean, Rio Tinto was a sorry case. They caught out doing bad things, but all extractive industries are as bad as Rio Tinto is. It was just one instance of the Western Australia Juukan Gorge, where they destroyed an ancient Aboriginal sacred site, and they violated the terms of condition. They never disclosed they were going to explode Site 4, and they carried out the extraction because iron ore is profitable, it's important, and that's going to fetch them profits. So heads rolled, CEOs resolved, but they resigned, but they took home a fat bonus, as it happens with all extractive industries which have no accountability. The thing with these industries is, unless they are in courts, they have an opportunity to be penalized, unless there is an exact law that they have violated. If they're just doing things that they have always obtained state sanction, they're never going to be caught out. So the kind of public uproar was just one of instance, because Rio Tinto has an ancient history of oppression of people in Bougainville, where they had copper mines, and wherever it has industries, their footfall is all over. In Canada, they have interests in dam hydroelectric power generations, tar sands. In South Africa, cobalt mines. In Australia, in all sorts of uranium and the copper and iron ore industries. So there was just one sorry instance where they caught her and they were feeling sorry for themselves, then apologizing to the communities, and they haven't been held to account yet. So there have been two reports. There's been the interim report, which is from the Parliamentary Committee, and also the final report, where they laid out future pathways for how they can recompense or do this thing right. But how are you going to bring the site that's been destroyed? So this was a site, the kind of visibility gave it the attention. But what about the constant destruction of sovereignties? What about the plunder of resources? And they never pay back the community. So there's always this royalties, which is carrot, and the penalties if they breach the non-disclosure agreement, which is the stake. So when something is tangible, it tends to attract more attention, which happened with the Jukan destructions, but most of the times incommensurable losses of land and sovereignty. And also Rio Tinto was, well, they were really, really egregious years, and they destroyed without the permit or without informing the communities. But a lot of others, something like Andrew Forrest, they hold a great stake in how the economy is governed and defined. He holds a great stake in how land is distributed. But he is now the face of non-extractivist green energy development. But I think the Fortescue mining group, the exact industry which has been extracting resources, is now furthering green colonialism in both in Southern Africa and all over Australia. So we shouldn't really distract ourselves from one industry or one event, but to see patterns of accumulation and expropriation and dispossession. So if the standout instance of Rio Tinto drew our attention to how these corporations are designed to act with impunity, then we should think about a broader question of how do we challenge these structures of impunity and not just trying to remedy this one instance. So they might be happy to have a payout. They're not legally obliged to do any of this. So the final report in the parliamentary committee asked all the extractive industries in Australia to hold a further moratorium, Western Australia to hold a further moratorium, because their heritage laws are really, really poor, and it doesn't give the Indigenous communities the power to veto anything. It doesn't give them an equal voice in which industries is let in and how they operate or how their heritage should be concerned. So they wanted to hold a moratorium until a new act is put in place so that they can further protection. But none of the industries agreed. So there you go. What does this highly visible event do to the entire ideology of extraction? I mean, if your profits depend on it, you will guard it with your life. So you're not going to guard the heritage site with your life. Obviously, it's of no interest to you. It's about whether you can get away with something or not. So there's no point in hoping allies are made out of extractivism. They are always going to be the other side you have to wage war against.
Yeah. So just to be clear, there has been no reparation whatsoever from Rio Tinto to the community.
Yeah.
Okay. And the heads rolling you mentioned were just people being fired or quitting.
Yes.
Yeah.
They exited very gracefully.
Yeah. You can't fire me, I quit.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's just that's painful to think about. Yeah, the one of the cases that I've been really watching over the last year or two has been the one of Steven Donziger with ExxonMobil. I don't know if I guess you also have been kind of seeing around. That was also a really scary one because of the I don't know, like the message that it sends to people who want to act and the potential for retribution, which obviously for, again, like we said, this is different realities for different people. For Indigenous people and people of color in different countries around the world, especially in global South, of course, self-defense and action has always had retribution and has always had violent consequences. I guess for a lot of people, this case was a bit of a shock because this time around it was someone who was from, I guess, the global North, and also who's a lawyer, which is a kind of class of people that you don't really see often being punished for something, or even just being attacked for something. And Steven, for those who don't know, basically managed to win a huge lawsuit against, I think it was ExxonMobil, and to the tune of $9 billion, something like that, payout to the people of Ecuador, I think it was. And the case is very shady. It's very complex as well, because they basically are as far as I understood it, at least, they are trying to get him on charges of like mafia-like behavior or something like that. These sort of weird charges saying that he didn't want to give over his computer and phone with contact information and all that of his clients because well, he did it for obviously privacy reasons and to safeguard their information, but they then argued that it was because he was racketeering or part of this like mafia-like behavior. So Steven has been facing hundreds of days in house arrest and went to prison recently. I think he is out now and serving the rest of his sentence at home again in house arrest. But the judge was, what was her, do you know her name? Loretta something?
Judge Kaplan was the first one.
Oh,
And
Judge
now
Kaplan,
there's
okay.
That's his first trial court.
Yeah, and then this other judge was apparently also potentially in league with Exxon. I mean, there was a whole like. I'm sure there'll be a film of this.
Oh God, no! Have you watched Dark Waters?
Dark Waters? No, I haven't.
Yeah, it's a lawyer who took on Roger Blight, I think, who took on Teflon and the cancerous contamination of the products, and he was tortured through prolonged harassment as well. So I mean, whoever takes on these big corporations has to pay this price. I mean, think of what they do to indigenous, I mean, environmental defenders. Doesn't have to be indigenous. The number of environmental defenders who are getting killed. So whoever takes on these corporations have to face their surveillance and slap suits and so the equator was Chevron. So Chevron is the nasty one who's dealing with Steven Donziger. ExxonMobil is pulling a new stunt, which is using the freedom of speech to slap down all climate litigation in Texas. I don't know what the fate is going to be, because they're going to claim they can endorse climate denialism because it's free speech.
I'm gonna get a defamation lawsuit from Exxon for mixing them up.
Oh, they're going to be happy.
Bad guy number one, bad guy number two. My bad.
Oh God, it's extremely painful, the realities of climate litigation and ongoing climate struggle. But we're grateful for people like Donziger because he fought for the communities, and he knew he was going to pay up that cost, and it's been going on for years. Imagine the kind of pressure he has to endure, because the communities haven't got the clean pay up at all. Chevron has been appealing the claim because 9 billion, well, they're not going to pay, although their turnout was in trillions. And he released, I think last year, Steven released an internal memo by Chevron, which said, well, the cleanup is going to cost it's just 0.2% increase in what we had estimated, but it's just waste of resources on indigenous people. We don't have to do it. So it's the kind it's the kind of animal we are dealing with. So naturally you can understand what kind of anger it generates.
For sure. Are there, just to kind of finish up on, are there on a potentially more positive note, are there things that give you optimism, that kind of infuse you with optimism around green criminology, around environmental justice that you're seeing in the world right now? Or is there nothing? I don't know, maybe it's all depressing.
Which is why I stay with the quotes, because it makes me happy, because every now and then there's one positive judgment. But I think we should believe in people's movement, because we have always been fighting this. The resistance is immemorial, irrespective of which nation you look at. You have always responded. I think whether we have something to be elated about, or we are getting depressed with the kind of things unraveling around us, there's always people's movement that we have to put our faith in. And we are part of it, right? We're having this conversation because the three of us care here. And we want to work on this field because it matters. And we're not just doing it for some kind of claim or fame, because it has to make this tiny bit of conversation can make a difference to a community. Because if can reach out to other people, then, well, this hopefulness that we have invested in people's movement, Marx would want this out of us. So I think Marx keeps me motivated.
That's a great note to end it on. Sakshi, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for coming and teaching us all about this. It's really a topic that we honestly don't really touch on regularly or don't know much about. So thank you so much for that. And do you want to maybe plug where people can find you? Maybe your blog as well, which is fantastic blog, by the way.
Thank you. Mostly it's my field notes from field work, but yes, I'm
Still
trying
enjoyable
to
to read. It's and good
Yes.
pics as well. So it's always fun.
Oh yes, I'm a photographer as well. But yes, you can find me on Twitter where I'm mostly active, talking both work and nonsense because I want to keep it a very informal space, and I've met lots of my friends there. So I'm happy to chat with you on Twitter anytime.
Yeah.
And
So that's at Sakshi Aravind.
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
that's right.
Yeah, and then your blog as well, which
It's called
really
Defiant Ecologies.
Yeah, there you go. So defiantecologies.home.blog. That is a really great place if you want to see what the life of a researcher is like, and very honestly, really well written, and some great pics as well, like I said. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Big thank you to our Patreons as well for always supporting us. Without you guys, the show is not really that possible because it costs a lot. We knew when everyone was starting up podcasts.
By the way, as well.
Yes.
Thanks so much.
And yeah, if you're watching this live, you can also find this episode back on YouTube in probably a few days. If you prefer the audio version, this is on Spotify, Apple Podcast, all the places that you listen to your stuff. And I think that's pretty much it. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes.
Have
a good day.
Bye. You too.
Bye.